Hey guys, and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface, Lesson 8. Up until this point, I've held back on breaking down how to design and build your own models, and that is because I needed to make sure beginners understood the tools and workflow I used. But now I feel I've explained enough to finally jump in and show you what designing meshes in real time is all about. If the course was for intermediate to advanced users, this would have been the first lesson because I'm going to be focusing much less on the tools used and devoting more time on trying to explain how I'm designing things and the basic laws that dictate how different shapes can be created and continued on from each other. Guys like Fausto Di Martini and Vitaly Bolgarov were the first to truly master this type of modeling, but over time I began to develop my own style to try and separate myself from those guys. So I'm hoping this lesson is going to be the best lesson yet and one that you get the most out of. So as you can see up in the viewport here, I've got a front end of a spaceship that I've designed and created in my spare time over the last couple of weeks. The reason we're going to be working with a piece like this is because it's a great example for getting curves to flow nicely. The mesh has areas of visual rest where things aren't so cluttered, and I'll get into that. But the reason we need areas like that is because it's very easy to go overboard with the details. And even at this point, there's probably still too much going on. This isn't the final piece, but I did need to get the lesson out. So we're going to be starting with creating a piece similar to this, but it won't be identical to this, because the point of the lesson is to be able to work in real time and make changes and experiment. The most boring thing I felt about modeling is, after a couple of years, is that when you sit there recreating the same things over and over, like cars and guns and things like that, you end up becoming a little bit bored with the idea of copying other objects. So the biggest gratification I had while working as a modeler was being able to design and shape my own characters and objects. So that is why this lesson, for me personally, is the most important lesson in the course, because I finally get to show you kind of how I experiment with edge extrusion modeling and my design theory. So everything taught in this lesson is pretty much pure old school, except for the fact that I've got Octane set up here. So when I rotate around the viewport, I can very quickly see how reflections are reacting and the overall look and feel of the object. This isn't something I used to do because we didn't actually have Octane available, 4 or 5 years ago. So besides having this set up, and we'll do that later in the lesson after we've blocked out the mesh a little bit more, everything here is as old school as it gets. We're just going to be working with simple edge extrusion, starting from some really low res geometry, and then I'll just experiment and show you kind of what I'm feeling in real time about the mesh and how I can alter it and change it, and how there's not really that much importance placed on a clean mesh early on. It's more about a clean workflow. So in my opinion, the best workflows are the ones that are the least restrictive for your artistic needs. However, at the end of the day, we still need to make the mesh look technically perfect with correct edge hardness and bevels. However, I don't worry about that until much later on, because it's very hard to go in and make design changes when you've got a really high-res mesh. So I try and keep everything as low-res as possible so that I'm not restricting myself later on, and so that I can actually move large portions of the mesh around without worrying about having to go in and redo 50 bevels and things like that. So throughout my career, I always joked that I didn't understand why people liked my work, because it was just so typical and mainstream. All I ever did was robots, mechs, and chicks, and things like that, and I never really strayed from it. So while there was guys doing some really far out there and crazy design work on robots and mechs like Vitaly Bolgarov, taking things in that realistic, machined and military style, I was trying to come up with a way that would incorporate my modeling with something a little bit different. So I found it funny that in order to try and come up with something different, I had to resort to the most mainstream artwork ever created, and they're tribal tattoos. So the thing with tribal tattoos is that you have the ability to build up objects purely from curves. So you can see here we've got a spider tribal tattoo, and it's basically just a bunch of curves. And I've actually used this exact image in past works to figure out the shape of curves that I'm going to use on my meshes. So that's a secret I've been holding on to that I'm glad to finally let out. But before we jump into Max, if you take a look through here, you can see that you get some really amazing ideas on how to work with curves and how to get them to blend together in harmony. So even things like eyes mixed in here, I could potentially trace those curves in 3D, or maybe not exactly trace, but just work with similar curves and then start blocking out my geometry from that. It's also interesting to note that if you even look at kind of tribal tattoos done over human anatomy, you can get an idea for modeling mech suits and things like that. So characters like my Moro, I used kind of similar principles as to what's going on here to construct those pieces. So I'd highly recommend you do a lot of research into tribal tattoos if you're going to try and create something similar to what I've been doing. Now, it's also important to realize that this is just one way of going about constructing a mesh. Throughout the lesson, I'm also going to try and break down the tools used and how I can kind of vary from this. A lot of the times with tribal tattoos is you'll find that they're too pointy. So I try and find a balance of soft edges and hard edges. So if we just go back to the tribal tattoo here, probably my favorite curve of all time is this one here, where you've got a large elliptical shape going into a sharp point, and then you've got the reverse on the other side. So if I go into Max here, a lot of the meshes I create start with that very basic curve. So if I hide these other 2 points, you can see here we start with this, and I haven't refined this at all because we're going to do this with the actual geometry. But basically from this main shape we've got going here, I'll just do a little bit of refinement on it. To make the counter to this, you can go in, and do it this way. So both points here are smooth. And you end up with a kind of shape like that. Let me just put the same wireframe color on. Or what you can do is I'll just move this to the side. You can kind of pull that shape in here and then come back out this way and then back out this way. And I'll just need to refine this. Just kind of working it in. and you get the idea. So, varying between these two, you've both got a couple of nice curves flowing here, and the whole mesh will revolve around this one shape. From here, because it's such a simple curve, we've only got a couple of options to build out from this piece. So, you can see here we've got this main point flowing out. So realistically, from here, you've kind of got two options. You can flow geometry out this way, or you can flow geometry out this way. On the inside curve, because we're a lot smoother, we have less options there. So we can either flow the inside curve like this and create another hard point out here somewhere and keep that flowing in, perhaps. And in these little pieces here, in these little circular bits, that's where I'd probably go in and we'd add some circular detail. So before I actually went in and would create objects, and obviously at this point I'm experienced enough to not have to go in and do things like this, I would experiment with splines in 3ds Max just to create some of my own tribal shapes to work with. Of course, you've got the option always for rivets, you could put them in these areas. Now you see from here, we've got another area we can keep blending off of. So I could come out here and then come in this way. And this is just one possible example. So you can see what's happening is this curve that's flowing out here. Let me just hide this for you. This curve that's flowing here naturally wants to flow into this one. So even though there's a gap between these 2 points, they're kind of lining up. And it's very difficult in 3D. This is just in one dimension to get that stuff lining up. But in 3D, it becomes even harder because then you've got things bending backwards also. However, once you start kind of dragging edges out and blocking things, you can get a better feel for how to quickly finish off the mesh. So if I create a point here that smooths down, I can actually think to myself, alright, well it's the front of a spaceship we're creating, so there's naturally going to be some type of ventilation for airflow, so I can continue a kind of curve going down here. And this curve could be our vent. Then I know that I've got this outer shape being created. So from here, I can think to myself, okay, so now we need to realize that the vents are probably going to be quite big if it's a sci-fi ship. So I can create another curve to define the outer edge. So I could come up from the outside here and kind of in conjunction with this curve here, we're just going to get them flowing together. Then on the underside, if I just unhide one of these other curves I just created, we can see that we've got a couple more options. I can continue another curve down from this point and just spread it out a little bit more. Well, actually, that point does become that curve, so we don't even need these two. And we just naturally keep building out from that initial curve. Now there's one thing I don't like to do is, and you'll notice if I go straight back to this raw curve here, one thing that doesn't usually work in 3D is when you have a point and then you pull that point back in. So if I grab these two and pull them in, we lose a lot of the harmony that's happening here. Now, to counter this, you need to make sure that on the inside line, you've got it flowing correctly again. So I can kind of come up like this maybe. And then the same principles will follow. But in terms of creating sci-fi details, I don't usually work with these type of shapes unless I'm trying to create a very mean and serious look to the character. So now we've got a little bit more of that tribal feel happening, but in terms of a sci-fi spaceship or something, you just don't usually see that very often. That's why I like to continue the shape outwards. And finally, before we jump into 3D, I just want to show you the first update I posted on this character from the last. Now what happens is using this workflow, things exponentially slow down as you complete the model, because the finishing touches on the model are what take the longest, going in and making sure that everything's perfect, all the curves are flowing together nicely. And this mesh on the left here doesn't even have that level of quality yet. However, you can see at the start here, I'm just kind of playing with some shapes. There's areas that haven't been blocked out correctly that changed later on when I realized that this vent shape wasn't working, for example. And then this shape being blended up here wasn't working. So I'm constantly looking to refine and make big changes to the mesh. From memory, making those changes was the hardest thing I could do as an artist. In my whole career, nothing was harder for me than scrapping something I'd spent an hour or two on, only to realize that, you know, it was useless and it wasn't working. I think the thing that separated myself from a lot of other guys is that I would happily post a finished project, take a look at it maybe 4 or 5 days later, and then realize it was shit, and then have to go in and redo a lot of the parts. And you get sucked into a little bit of a trap of being a bit of a perfectionist, trying to change those things. But being a perfectionist is something I definitely learned. When I first started, because I was impatient and because all I wanted to do was, you know, kind of prove myself and what I was capable of, I'd post heaps of updates, and without even realizing, because I just kept posting so many, 99% of them were terrible. So I kind of, after realizing how crap some of the updates I was posting were, I said to myself, you know, screw this, I'm just going to keep trying to improve and improve on the mesh, looking at reference, going back and actually committing myself to finishing off a mesh properly. And when I made that mindset change and let go of the ego attached and kind of accepted that for 99% of the modeling stage the mesh wasn't going to look good, I started to improve exponentially faster, because then I let go of that fear of posting bad updates and just force myself to only post stuff that I thought I was happy with. So we'll jump into 3D now, and I'll try and explain exactly what I've just done with the 2D splines, what I'm trying to do in 3D while designing some stuff. So we've got a clear scene, and as usual, I'm just going to drag out a plane on the front and set up the symmetry for that. Set the length and width segments to 1. It doesn't matter the shape of the polys. I'm going to set the pivot to 0 and add a symmetry over the top. I'm not going to worry about adding a turbo smooth yet. So from here, it's important to note that I kind of use a whole bunch of different methods to move and shape polygons. Rather than just sticking to purely moving points, I'll happily select them and rotate them into shape and just vary things up. So if you see me doing the same type of movement with a different tool, just realize that that's just trying to make things as easy as possible on myself and not restrict myself to one type of movement. So another thing you'll notice that throughout this tutorial is that I swap between using view rotation, view move mode and screen mode. So in order to do that, you can go up there and click screen, and now you can see we're moving there. Like I explained in the first lesson, you can also use this inside box to move with screen mode, but I find that's quite annoying to select every time. See, it kind of pops in and out of selection mode. So what I'll do often is I'll hit Alt and right click and swap to screen mode, and that just gives me the ability to move things into place with a lot more control than view mode, where you might get stuck having to go forwards, left, down. Now it's also important to realize that things will be quite messy. I don't work clean right up until the very end of the modeling stage when I've blocked out the design. Until then, I'm kind of just treating it like a painter would by blocking out the main shapes first and then slowly refining as I go. They'll just quickly add up their layers, they'll start adding little highlights and refining the edges, and I work the exact same way. I don't like being restricted by the software, so this method I'm using is designed to make things as easy as possible for me. So from the front view, I'm just going to start blocking out that curve that we were laying out before, and that's going to serve as the basis for the whole mesh, and I'll just start dragging out edges from that main curve we create. So another thing is that I probably explained in the earlier lessons, sometimes I'll just drag out a bunch of geometry and then start shaping those vertices one by one. You'll notice that I'm not trying to keep the thickness of this the same or anything like that, and I'll continue to do that throughout the lesson also. I'm going to do my best to explain everything I'm doing as I'm going, but there will be times now that I'm doing things a little bit more complex and in real time that I don't have the physical mind power to be modeling and explaining everything that's happening at once. But hopefully you kind of understand that all the tools I was explaining in the earlier lessons are just quite simple and repetitive, and we don't need to do anything too complex to make any of these shapes. So at this point, I want to put a turbo smooth on, and I'll just set it to 2 iterations and isoline display. And I'm just going to start blocking out the depth of the object. can see when I've got more than one object to rotate into place, I can just select all of those at once. And I'm trying to keep roughly a nice curve flowing this direction also. But this will need a lot of refinement later. So this is the most important piece of the whole mesh. If you're running out, if you don't have that point coming to a hard line, at this point we can always just add a support loop there to create that. You can see I've swapped to screen mode there, so that's another instance. So if you see that swap very quickly from this mode to this mode, I'm just once again hitting Alt right click and setting it to screen. Here I'm just going to add another hard point so that we can create that outer shape. Now you'll see that we're creating a little pinch this way. I'll explain later on how to fix that. But at this point we don't have enough geometry to fix that. On the inside point, coming off this main point, we can get away with going thicker than the other parts of the mesh. And the same can apply for out here. This point can go out wider and then come in thicker. And then when you have the two balancing, you end up with a nice clean shape. So from here, I want to create the second line, and we're still in the early stages. This will still need a lot of refinement, but because we don't have enough information to kind of start blocking out the whole mesh and seeing how this needs to be refined, we can just go in and add a little bit more detail. So one thing I do is to continue on from a point, and if you remember earlier in the lesson, I was saying from here we can continue on out. What I like to do is I create an edge loop to select, drag it out a couple of times, then select the ring on this side with Control W and delete it, and then I go in and delete that face. So now we've got an edge loop that's continuing on exactly from that angled edge, so we won't need to go in and manually, if we created this kind of separately, go in and spend time making sure that's lined up. You can just drag out. Here I'm going to create the exhaust, so I'm just creating a round shape here. And now, this might be a little bit tricky, but throughout the lesson, try and place a lot of focus on the camera angles I'm using. The easiest way to fix pinching is to rotate your camera so that the highlight is lining up with that angle, and then rotating to make it cleaner. So I'm constantly looking for that angle where that highlight's catching so I can see just how messy the object actually is. If you're trying to clean up pinching here, you can see there's no highlight on that area. So if I'm sitting here moving points around like so, I can't actually see what's happening. Whereas if I rotate to this angle, now you can see the highlights are catching and they're subtly catching on this side. So it's also important to realize that even if I want to make an adjustment on this side, sometimes I'll rotate the camera angle, and as I'm moving the geometry over this side, I'm actually looking at the geometry on this side and seeing the highlights there. So you can see I'm catching some highlights on this side, but not this side. However, I'm moving the geometry over there. So I can move things into place until they're, nice and clean, or as clean as they can be at least. From here, I'm going to do the same technique. I'm just going to drag out that edge and delete it. You can see I'm rotating and scaling. I don't have to just move the points like this. I'm going to try and get this to line up with that point. Now, if I want to move these points backwards here, what I have to make sure is that this curve flows back into that. So it probably looks a little bit better like this. You can see now from this angle I've rotated the camera, we get that curve flowing down. Just going to pull that point out a little bit more. So you can see I'm experimenting with the angle at which this shape is coming off of. Just constantly looking around here. Might add another edge loop on the inside here. So I've just gone in and connected that. Then I'm going to get this edge to line up to this one. So what I can do is I can hit bridge, cut an edge loop along here, and then delete that point. And then using that method, I've got these 2 points lining up exactly where they should be. And I can just keep modeling out. You can see here I'm just changing everything up by grabbing all these points and scaling them in. And now I want to get this piece, because it's connecting here, I want this to actually keep flowing down. So I can select these 2 edges and drag them out twice, once again. Delete that inside point, and then weld these 2 points. So now the topology isn't flowing correctly. So we need to make a couple of adjustments there. Now I need to cut from down here and here, so that this edge loop keeps flowing down. I'm always trying to make things flow in a way that I can select a ring and it's going to flow all the way through the mesh. But now you can see this point needs to be hard, so I can just go in and connect that. Here I've swapped to view mode so I can move only forwards and backwards, like so. Whenever I want to move everything kind of together, I'll just grab a whole bunch of vertices and move them. And what I'm going to do is as I'm moving them, I'm going to look at the other side and just kind of move things in a whole bunch of different directions until I find a location that looks better than it did before. If it doesn't look better than it did before, moving them in every direction, then I'll keep it the same. So now I'm going to add another edge loop on the inside here. And then delete this point. You can see that's continuing on again. Now I'm going to select all the vertices and move them a little bit further apart. So just rotating around the mesh, I've noticed that these 2 points are too high. So I'm going to pull those down because we're going to try and create a more rounded feel to this top point. So when we go in and add thickness to these surfaces, we're going to need to keep a flow going this way as well. So at this point, it's important to realize that we should probably start looking from these underneath angles and getting a curve flowing across the shape of the ship this way. I'm now going to grab these points and drag these back. And you can see I just drag all of them at once. Then I'm going to scale these top points down and align them up here. Just grabbing all those points, making sure they're aligned. So this is the benefit of having low-res geometry to start with without adding too much detail. I can grab all these points and just move them out. Now another tool I haven't used yet is the edge snap. So I'm just going to turn that on. You can see I'm just snapping those points in, trying to bring these points into a smaller area. In terms of my navigation, it's just a combination of swapping between show and result mode, scaling, hitting S, and rotating, and you can see when you combine that, it all comes together quite quickly. So now these points coming from here are going to smaller points. And rather than I could just continue on with this same curve going in the whole way, but things won't look as good. And let me just flatten this off. It just doesn't look as good if that same curve continues on. So every so often you want to vary that up. So what I'm going to do is from this point, I'm going to drag an edge out from here. As usual, I just drag 2 points out to give myself something to work with. I can remove this with Control Remove. I'm just going to have a quick play with a couple of shapes in this area. Try to bring this around for the cockpit. So I'm going from this side view to make sure that the continuation of this curve is flowing nicely. And then we can perhaps weave this back in. But one thing I'm noticing is that this point down here, they're all too flat. it has this sudden drop off, so the whole mesh is flowing at this angle, and then we get to here and it all just kind of stops suddenly. So I need to rotate these points all at once and move them into place. And now maybe at the bottom here I can start to round those off. And I'm just going to select all these points and keep that flow going. You can see what's happening is they're going in a little bit at the moment. You need to keep them going out. Scale these points. And as I'm going, I'm just enhancing these curves. You can see what's happening here is we're bending them in, but the topology down here isn't flowing at the correct angle. So by rotating all those at once, the topology is going to keep flowing correctly. Now I'm going to finally bridge the gap in the center here to get a feel for how wide the cockpit is. And I still don't think it's wide enough, so I'm going to grab every single vertice and just move those out a little bit. And I'm going to add a second support loop here and try and make the front of this cockpit area a little bit more flat. So you can see without that edge, it's looking cool, but it doesn't really have the hardness I want. So I've added in a second support loop. I'm just going to bring that in until I'm happy with it. I'm going to try and get these points coming out more. And when I've done that, sometimes you'll have to grab every single other vertex on the mesh and just rotate that. Now you can see the thickness of these points here don't correlate to these points here. This piece is a bit too thick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all these points, swap to screen rotate, and just move those in. And you can see now that I've moved those points out, this point here has lost its continuity. So I'm going to go to the other side and just move those out until that pinching's gone. Just constantly rotating around the object to make sure it's doing what I want. So one thing I like to do is using the Z hotkey. If I want to rotate around a specific point, you can see if I'm over here and rotate, it's not going to do that. So what I'm doing also, and with my hands still on the keyboard the exact same way they've been the whole time. I'm just going to hit Z. And what I'm going to do in the next lesson is I'm going to try and, for a segment of the lesson, record what my hands are doing so you can see they never leave. One of the things that beginners do is they take the hand away from the keyboard, and that's just it's the worst rookie error you can make. Always have your hands in the exact same spot so that left hand isn't moving away from those hotkeys. So this is the first area where I'm going to just play with adding a little bit of hardness, and you can see I'm not going to do it mathematically with any connect tool. With any connect tool. I'm just going to use the cut tool to add a little bit of hardness to this edge, so you can start to get a little bit of a feel for that flow coming in. You see, if we don't have that point, this curve doesn't look like it keeps flowing from this point down here. However, as soon as we go in and do that, you'll see in a second, now that this point hits here and keeps flowing down, which is exactly what we want. Just going to add another point here. Sometimes you don't have enough geometry to work with when you need to add new stuff, and you'll notice that I only add new geometry where I need it, keeping things as low res as possible. If I drag out this edge and connect all these points here, knowing that potentially later on I'm going to need them, now when I go in and try and move these points, I've got to move all those together. Whereas if I don't have those points there, I can happily select all this stuff and move it, and know that the only points I've got to fix are down here. Now I'm going to select this inside point and just start bringing this up. And like in the car lesson, I'm just going to keep the edge loops spaced the same. I'm going to connect these two pieces together with the bridge tool, and just see how that's starting to look. And if I'm not happy with it, I'll just delete it again. So now I've connected these 2 points, and what I potentially want to do is add another vent in the center above the cockpit. So to do that, see in a second, I'm just going to move this point out a little bit more. I'm going to try and space this one a bit more evenly. And I'm just going to connect without worrying about kind of where I'm connecting to. A point like this, and then I'm going to delete that and just take a look. So what this vent is going to do is it's going to balance out the 2 side vents we've got here. From here I can connect these points or weld these points. And now I can start shaping that vent hole. Whenever I select any vertice on the inside, I swap to view mode so that I move on the correct axis. You'll see if I do that with screen mode, what happens is when I move them, it's going off the center. So that's where I'll just swap to there. connect these two pieces, because I'm just trying to figure out what I want to do with this inside shape. We obviously need to make it fairly intricate, but this is one of the most important pieces, so I'm just going to take my time and figure out the best way to connect this together. So you can see when I use the connect tool, I don't care about the topology. I'm just trying to cut the shape that I want, and I'll worry about cleaning it up later. You can see we've got a nice shape happening here, so I'm just going to connect a point in here and then delete this so that these flow together. And when I do that, we've got this point coming down to a triangle here, so I can just connect this here like so all the way through. And when I connect those 2 points, delete this point and connect to here, our topology keeps flowing nicely, and we have the option to go in and add hardness to that. So I'm going to go in and connect one more point throughout here. And you could use Flow Connect like I was showing up here. But I find that it doesn't always work as good. I'm using edge constraint to slide these up. And the same type of edge loop flow that we've got going here, we need to continue that down here. So actually for this piece, what I think I can do is connect along there and connect here. And then when I delete that edge loop, now we're in a better place. And I can connect a point here and here and go all the way to the back. And we've got those two flowing nicely. So rather than adding edge loops down here where I'm not sure I need them yet, in this area we're running out of some geometry to work with. So I'm just going to connect in between these 2 points and continue on. And still, because we're so low res, I can keep playing with different kind of thicknesses, because one thing that I don't feel like's happening on this mesh yet is we're getting enough kind of bulbous shape around the front, enough to kind of justify a full rounded shape like this. So we need more thickness in the overall geometry. So that's where I'm just going to go in and select quite a few vertices at once and just play around with moving them. So here I'm going to bridge the gap. You can see we've got a little bit too much spacing around this area. But rather than drag these points all the way over, I'm probably seeing now that we're going to need geometry there anyway, so I'm just going to drag some points out to work with and then weld that up to here. Now I can connect this piece, and that's going to keep flowing nicely. However, I want this piece to flow together here, and right now that's not happening. So what I can do is I can select these 2 points and just give this whole area a little bit more thickness, because now we're going to keep this flow happening, this flow along here. So that's why I'm pulling these points out. And you can see the reason I'm swapping between show and result is because with show and result selected, it's much harder to see the vertices. Whereas if I go to the lowest subdiv value, I can see exactly what vertices I've got selected. There's no yellow and orange cage hovering over, so I might have, sometimes you accidentally select a vertice down here, for example, and you don't notice it because of the yellow, and you move some points, and then 10 minutes down the road you realize you've moved this and you've got to move it back. So to avoid that, that's why I constantly am swapping between show and result mode. So just try and get in the habit of it. I know it's probably not natural for you to do it, but it's what helps out the workflow the most. So you can see we've got a vertice selected on the inside, so I've gone back to view mode for rotating. I'm just going to come around from the other side and maybe get this cockpit coming down a little bit more. And you'll notice if you've ever got a vertice overlapping and you can't see it, I hit F3 and show and result so that I can see the back end of the selection, and then I'll just move it back into place. Then on this inside piece, I'm going to cut another little vent hole, and I'm just going to delete these inside points. So now you can see the problem when I have these edge loops here. If I want to fix the roundness going this way, I don't have edge loops supporting it. So that's where I need to make sure at this point that I go in and select those and cut some edge loops in between. So that I can start blocking that out. Now on this centerpiece, I don't want it to go exactly towards the, I don't want it to connect entirely. So I'm going to connect a piece in the center and delete that edge ring. And that's going to leave us with a little kind of sci-fi detail there. This piece I do want to connect though. So I'm just going to select those 2 vertices and move them to 0. And then make the gap here the same size as the gap roughly in all the other places. So now we've cut a little bit of detail, we can start to possibly fix the topology so that we've got something a little bit cleaner to work with. So what I mean by that is we can go in and add a vertice, an edge loop around this side. like so. So now that edge ring, if I select it, loops around the outside. This point here, I'm going to connect like so. Connect these two. So we've still got all quads. Now, even though quads aren't necessary in my workflow, I do like to, at least at this early stage, kind of do my best to work with them. So I don't care if I don't, but it does make things a little bit easier when you do have quads, because there's a more likelihood that your edge rings are going to flow together nicely. So this is where a little bit of design theory comes in. You can see this point I've cut isn't exactly working with the rest of the shapes. So everything we've got here in terms of the roundness on the beveling, it's kind of, you'll notice a similarity between this type of curve, even this type of curve. But then on this particular shape, we don't have that. So to get that back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these points in and then move these points back. Then if I select these vertices, I can pull them in like so. I'll probably delete this point. And this point. Still not there yet though. So you can see I've just connected a little point there and left that vertice hanging. And because I'm not happy with how the topology is flowing here, I'm just going to connect a point, and this is where my workflow doesn't really matter about quads at the moment. I'm just going to connect a point along here, then I'm going to connect it up to here. We're going to try and redirect some flow coming down here. And I'm just going to pull this in like so. And connect these 2 points. Then I can connect up here and here. And the goal is to keep the edge loops flowing, but I'm redirecting them. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to try and experiment with just adding a little curve in here. So what I do is I connect another edge loop on the inside edge closest to where I want that hardness. I'll select it and remove the last selected edge so that when I pull this in, it doesn't get affected past that point. And I'll do the same down here, and I'm going to rotate my camera angle and pull that in, just so that we can start to see the curve I'm creating there. And then here I'm going to connect some points here because I need the same amount of geometry flowing from one point to the next. And when we add those edge loops, now that's become too hard. So I need to pull those down. And things are going to get a little bit messy when you start to go in and do this stuff. But the next stage when you do these types of cuts is to go in and keep the curvature flowing. So you're not worrying about topology as much as keeping the curves flowing together. And when you worry about that over the topology ends up looking good anyway. I can actually just experiment. I'm going to move this point down as well. So this time I'm selecting the polygons because I want to move all of them. If I just move the edges there, you can see it's going to create a little wobbly point. So that's where I select just the polygons, move them into place. Connect up here and then continue down here. If you ever miss a point, I just hit Q and target weld them back up. Now I can move these forward, and this shape here we're going to try and once again get the same type of curve that's happening everywhere else. There's a little bit of pinching going on because these points all aren't aligned, but that's fine. Just slowly move them into place every time. Connect this point here. Keep an edge loop flowing around this edge. I'm going to pull this down in view mode to start to add a little bit of shape and roundness to the surface. And what happens is you start to see that this shape is just a little bit too wobbly. There's not enough curve going on there. So I can select all these points from the side view. I'm just going to bring them up. Now I might need to select all these points also and just rotate them forward and pull those up. So here I'm just trying to clean things up once again. Looking from these harsh angles, you can see that things start to not line up, and that's where I go in and just try and make those points one by one line up. But because the geometry is so low res at this point, it doesn't really take much time. Select these points here. And add an edge loop in between. And that'll give us more of a correct shape going on there. Now I'm going to create another edge loop around this ring. So you can see once the curves start to look nice, you can go in and get the topology working. So whenever I connect through, I just make sure to clean up those points. Now you can see if we add another point down here, all the topology is going to start to clean up quite quickly. So now on this inside point, I need to keep the topology flowing again. Except this time we're going to push it up a lot closer to create a little bit of a pinch there. You see that pinch that creates? And because I haven't altered the shape down here, the geometry, and because it's low res, things just keep flowing nicely. So I can connect up to here. And we'll probably have to change that. So I'm going to select all these and move them in to keep this curve flowing. And we'll worry about cleaning that up later. But for now, I just want to make sure the distance between these points is all the same. So I'm using edge constraint toggle to just slide these in. I'm going to delete this polygon. And just play with the overall curve here. So I select all 3 points together. From the other view, you can see when I move it over this side, there's a certain point where it starts to look, see there, it doesn't look as rounded and curved. But as I pull in, that curve starts to look a little bit cleaner. Select all these points. Now I'm going to connect a point along here on the inside edge. And just play with pulling this down because these points don't line up anymore. Okay, so I think I've spent enough time just working in this area. We can always come back to it. Even if things are pinching a little bit like they are, doesn't matter so much because there's going to be a lot of fixing to do later. You just want to try and block out the overall design first. So the next thing I want to do is I want to continue down from the cockpit and make the next part that will go underneath the ship. So as usual, I drag out one edge and then another and then just delete that. And then I can probably get rid of these two also, just so we've got the one polygon there. And I'm just going to drag out and create the underside. So you can see I've connected this point in here, but now we need to make that cockpit area keep flowing together. So I'm going to connect a point down here and then bring it back up. So this is going to create a little bit of detail where we can possibly, you know, bring in some stuff for that cockpit area. Another thing I'll experiment is the cockpit design at the moment is pretty simple. And you can see up here we're starting to get a little bit more intricate with things. So what I'll do is I'll bring this point in like so. And even though it's really rough, it just gives me a little bit more of an idea about how things are supposed to look, while at the same time keeping the type of detail we're adding relatively the same. So that point goes in probably too much. So when we add that point in, now I need to go in and loop the topology around so that we're not getting any pinching along this edge. Like so. Now these points need to terminate somewhere. So that's where I need to move these in, make them a little bit smaller. We're going to go in and add detail in this area later, but for now we just need to keep them flowing consistently. So I'm just going to roughly move them into place like so. And now this piece I'm going to go down a little bit more. It was just kind of breaking, it was too pointy on that inside piece. So I'm going to target one of those two together and then remove it, and you can see that vertex is still just floating there, which is just going to harden off that edge. So even though it's pinching, it doesn't really matter because it's just there to give this little edge hardness. Now I can pull this piece out and we can start getting this geometry to flow a bit more nicely. I'm going to add one more edge loop in between all these points. And you'll notice if I'm on edge mode and I rotate all those, it does it locally. But if I convert that selection to vertices and rotate, it doesn't. So I'll always do that by converting. Now we can go in and add some topology down the center here to keep this flowing. I'm just going to pull these points forward a little bit. And you'll see in a second, I'm going to pull these vertices forward to keep from above, once again, this overall flow happening. So I can actually probably select all these vertices here in order to fix this issue we've got on the mesh. Select everything from there below, swap to view mode, and then pull it forward. So now this point here, I can go maybe a little bit more forward. It's coming in a bit nicer. Then I'm going to grab all these points and move those forward also. From above, I can just get these points flowing a little bit better. Now this is breaking the curvature here. You can see if we go from the front, you'd expect, if I just draw out a line for you guys, you'd expect for this curve to keep flowing in like this, as opposed to what it's doing right now. So I'm going to add an edge loop along there. I'm going to select all these points and scale them, and then move them in to keep this loop continually flowing. Now you can see we're starting to break things down. Because it's a spaceship, it still needs to be aerodynamic, so that's why I was getting these points to flow a little bit better and have a little bit more of an angle on them. So you can see from this angle we're getting tons of pinching because it's all really messy, but that's fine. Just one by one select these points. So I'm just going to get these points and pull them a little bit closer. I'm going to grab all these points and pull these in as well. And that didn't work, so I'm just going to grab the shape of these vents. I'm not exactly happy with how angled they are, so I want them to go higher up here. So what I can do is I can select all these vertices at once, go from the front view and scale them down a little bit, and then just pull them up again. And grab these points and scale them in. Then I'm going to grab these points down the bottom here and just give this first panel a little bit of rounding. So I'm just looking at these pieces, and the shape of that vent isn't exactly very aesthetic. So I'm going to pull this point in a little bit more, because this rounded, this flat area is helping to make it look mechanical, as well as this point in here. We also need to realize that that curve isn't flowing correctly here, so I need to keep that going. We're just slowly getting things to line up. So with all the modifications we've been doing, we've kind of lost that main curve that was looking nice before. So this area here is actually meant to blend a lot more smoothly. So I'm going to fix it on this point, and then we'll move these points to fit that. rather than trying to do it all at once. I'm just going to delete this edge loop and connect this up here. Now I know those two aren't lining up, but there is a little bit of detail we're going to go in and add in there later, so it's not that important to me just at this stage. So now I'm trying to create a little bit of shape down here and we don't have the geometry to do it. So I'm going to connect an edge loop along the edge here. And now I can move this point where I want.